How you doing today, man?
Me, I'm doing pretty good.
Doing pretty good? Caught you on a good day?
Most days are good days.
That's great. How's the kid, man? Are you drinking
Kid's
beer
good.
right now?
No, that's a Diet Coke. Look,
Came on a podcast drunk?
Diet Coke. Kid is good. He'll be 3 in January, so starting to have agency.
That happened fast.
Yeah.
Budding JavaScript developer?
No, he uses my. I told a joke on the changelog that he told me. I said, "Oh, I'm a computer scientist. What are you?" And he said, "I'm a tablet scientist."
That's pretty good. Wow.
So I don't know if he intended to tell a joke, but I think he doesn't program.
Man, it's been really fun chatting with you the last few weeks / months. We kind of had this asynchronous conversation going between us three. Every time something interesting comes up, either something that we're discussing or kind of working through on our end, and you kind of hear about it in the podcast, or we kind of share, tweets that we see from like tech Twitter, and you always have interesting things to say about it. So we figured we should all just get on the mics and chat about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I've been enjoying listening to the podcast just because I don't have the intestinal fortitude to use React as much as you. And it's teaching me a lot of things it's getting into a lot of the details about what I expect or don't expect.
Yeah, like my programming experience is basically like Rails and Ember. And, your kind of thought and your approach to all this stuff has been like probably the biggest influence on me. And so as we've kind of dipped our toes into React, that's been, I think the most challenging thing for me has been that the guides and the docs and all that stuff, they don't have that same, at a very high level, they don't share that philosophical approach. It's much more hands-off. And you're kind of left like figuring things out yourself a lot of times.
Which I think is kind of the appeal in some ways. I think one of the biggest things that people end up liking about React, whether they know it or not, is that it feels like you're learning stuff when you're using it. I'm not going to say whatever. You can force me to say more by asking direct questions, but I think that's like a good thing. It's sometimes a bad thing, but I think it's a true thing.
Right. It definitely feels different. Like I've kind of been learning Vue at the same time, and Vue feels much more similar to something like Ember or Rails in that like, when you need a computed like derived value that's going to be reactive in the template, you put it under computed. And so in that sense, like you're learning Vue.
And I think a big part of it is like both Ember and React and Vue care a lot about communicating how things work in the terms that we expect people to be able to understand coming through the framework. Whereas React thinks that this is a new paradigm and we're going to like really insist that you understand the paradigm. And again, I'm not drawing judgment here. I think React is very popular. So like, let's not pretend that these are all snake oil salesmen, right? Like I think there's something to it, but React definitely says, I'm not going to teach you this thing from the perspective of where you're coming from. I'm going to insist that you get to where we want you to get. And then I'm going to give you the documentation in those terms. And I think there's a reason that there's external React documentation that has to recast it in terms of what you already know.
Right. Like you actually, if you want to build basically a to-do app that persists to-dos over the network, the React guides are actually not going to get you there. And
they might tell you you're thinking about it wrong a bunch.
I don't think so, actually. I actually don't think that that's an intended goal of the React docs. I was just speaking with some React developers last night. We were at like a Svelte meetup here, and we were chatting with folks who've done React development for years. And I kind of brought this up, and I was kind of saying like, oh man, React is really hard. Like I'm just trying to save it to do. I don't know how to do it. And they're kind of like, what? Like React has been around forever. It's easy. But then I start asking questions, and it's like, oh, right. Like saving it to do and like asynchronous callbacks here when the components unmounting or dealing with stale state, kind of some of the stuff I've been talking about, even on Twitter, EmberMap, or you on the side. Like these are actually things that are, there's not one answer to them. And so sometimes it can be hard for different folks to talk about them together.
Yeah, one thing that I will say I don't love about the React way of talking about this stuff is I think that it is true that these things are hard. And I think my view on things like, I want to save a to-do, and then maybe someone will navigate away from the page using the router, or maybe they'll there'll be an if statement that destroys the component in the meantime. What's supposed to happen? My view is like that would be considered a fundamental problem with the model, and we should try to figure out how to fix it. And we should I don't know, I don't like embarrassed, but we should be a little embarrassed of the fact that we don't have a very clear answer. Whereas I think the way React, and I think Vue kind of has the same point of view, no pun intended. But I think React is basically like, well, the answer is definitely functional programming. It is definitely Haskell or whatever, ML. And if we don't know the answer yet, it's just because we're using like JavaScript promises instead of some other React primitive that we still have yet to invent. There's nothing to be embarrassed of. There's just a gap between the current JavaScript-based programming model and the perfect like Reason ML model or whatever they have in their head. And therefore, like, you should come along for the ride while we figure it out. And I don't think is great.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I think also us being new to this whole ecosystem, like when you do talk with folks who are using React day to day and building real apps, whole apps that involve persistence and asynchronicity and all this stuff, they'll say things like, we use Apollo here.
Yep, I was going to say we just use Apollo.
Yeah, and that's valid in the sense that it's valid in the sense that like React is still accomplishing things for them, and they're able to get their jobs done with it as a tool. But it's also like it's not the whole story, which is,
to be honest, I really think that I need to avoid just saying negative things all the time, because that is, like, as you know, not at all how I feel. I think the original React showed a thing that was not obvious at the time, which is that the way of thinking about programming that is like, I'm going to render the whole page every single time based on the state that's there right now, is an improvement over the two-way binding model that like everyone else like came from Cocoa, and then MDV world, which was like the Chrome's aborted attempt to bring data flow into the browser, had it. Angular had it. Ember had it, right? Even to some extent, Backbone had it. And then React said, like, forget about all that. We're just going to do basically a top-down re-render, and we'll figure out how to make it efficient. And there was some hand-waving to that, but I think that mental model, like, that changed everything. Like, I think every framework that exists today is derived in some way from that point. And like, what's great about that is it's like a lot more fun. And I think I remember Ryan Florence talking about fun, like Ryan Florence, who was an Ember developer and became a React developer and wrote React Router. Like Ryan Florence said, wow, this is a lot of fun. And I think that's one way to think about it, right? One way to think about it is React showed that top-down re-render is a better way of thinking about things. And you can get a lot more done without having to worry about all this crazy data flow. Another way to think about it is React brought functional programming to the masses. And I believe that is how the React core team thinks about it. And therefore, everything that they have done since then is an attempt to make things feel more like the world that they would like to be in. And unfortunately, I think I was wanting to talk about use Apollo. So I think what goes wrong is that the reason Apollo works is because it doesn't actually agree with Sebastian Markbedge's 100% of his worldview, right? It's like, we got a lot done by saying that we should re-render from the top down, and now we'll have this escape valve. And I think in a lot of ways, the way people use Redux was similar, right? I think Redux is a little more purist, but ultimately, if you really talk to anybody using Redux, they say, Dan EmberMap even says, like, do you need Redux? I don't know. You can like pick and choose whatever. Maybe it's useful in this situation. Maybe it's not useful in that situation. And I think that's great. I think that's good. Unfortunately, that is not, like, that worldview doesn't match the worldview that the React core team is actually driving towards. And so there's increasingly this friction between the design that the React team is driving towards. And I think you guys have been talking about it as this disagreement about should effects be derived from state, that whole question, right? There's just a difference in how purist people want to be.
Right, and bringing the declarative model to every part of our programs instead of just the rendering. The rendering feels like a wonderful fit in both React and now in Ember and every other UI framework, basically. But then when it comes to doing things like make a post request and then set the state to loading false, that kind of thing is hard to, to wrap up in a declarative statement that can be thrown away if an effect is batched or a component is unrendered. Those are some of the kinds of things that most.
And you can see that there's an actual disagreement even at the thought leader level about like what is the right design, and like both of the designs have problems, but because there's a disagreement about what is the right design, none of the problems have to be addressed head on. And I don't think that's great for the React community. I think the React community ends up being better off when people do de facto standardize around stuff, and then you could actually get through the whatever the challenges are. But when people are still like, the React community goes back and forth, but right now it's in a mode where there's not really a strong agreement about what is the right thing. So everybody's like, oh, you don't like it? That's because you didn't do it my way. But then when you try to do it their way, it's like, oh, well, I didn't do it. The problem is you didn't do this other way. Do you remember that there was this flowchart that was like, I forgot what it was called, but it was like React makes me sad or something. And it was like presented in earnest, but it was a flowchart. It was like, did you use a boilerplate? Yes, no. And if you go down yes, it would say, well, the problem is maybe you shouldn't have used the boilerplate. You should have instead. And then if you go down the note path, it's like, maybe you should have considered using a boilerplate. And again, it was presented in earnest. I think there's a way of thinking about things where it's like, well, there's a perfect answer for every user, and you just have to find it. And like, it's a choose your own adventure personal path.
Yeah, there's definitely a desire for there to be more conventions. I think even though one of the appeals of React is its lack of convention. So maybe kind of to spin this a little bit more back towards the positive a little bit, because I think it's good to hear. Obviously, you're thinking on React's designs and kind of how React's like success has influenced how you think about component design, what APIs have made it from React and other frameworks back into Ember, all that stuff. We've talked a lot about that, but one question I'm kind of interested in is just stepping back, like, again, going back to maybe the positive angle, which is, what are some of the kernels from React and other frameworks that you found to be really meaningful kind of milestone watershed moments in UI development? And really one way to kind of think about this question would be, think about, Yehuda starting ember.js and what your opinions about UI development with JavaScript were. Kind of what are some of the biggest differences between that person and who you are today? Like what has changed most about your thinking there?
Yeah. So like I said before, it's easy for it to, like, if you think about all the words I'm saying, the overall tone is like too negative, and I'll try to stop doing that. But I'll reiterate what I said in the first place, which is that the realization that top-down re-rendering, that the way to think about it is that at every given moment, there's a bunch of input state, and you could like snapshot that in your head at least. And the UI on the screen is just the answer to rerunning the program. And like, how to make that efficient is the framework's job. That's not your job. I think that
you say that's the most influential.
I can't understate. I think I think it's pretty clear to me that if React hadn't done that, it's not so clear to me that it would never have happened. But I think it's pretty clear that it's like was not in anyone's head at the time that React started talking about it. I think React tended to talk about it in more, I don't know how to say, paradigm sense. And I think there is a big paradigm to it. One thing that I think isn't what happened is I don't think virtual DOM has a lot to do with it. Now, I think virtual DOM is a very important implementation strategy for a particular path. The path where you really are basically the two patterns that you could use if you're doing let's just call this declarative rendering, which I think is what you guys call it in EmberMap. The two patterns that you could take are, you literally are running the program and you are just making the updating. You decide something like DOM is the slow part or whatever, and like it's okay to run the whole program every time, and then you just compare the old one to the new one and you make the changes, something like that. That actually gets you a long way. And then the other declarative approach is the Ember approach, where it's like a declarative language for describing the nesting structure. And the JavaScript part is like kind of hanging off on the side. Mm-hmm. And so for like a way to see the difference is like an Ember if statement. What that's saying is at this point in the output, either the thing that's in the block is there or it's not there. There's no way to take that output and move it somewhere else. There's no way to even look at it unless you're literally looking at the real DOM output. And similarly, a loop in each statement in Ember is saying at this place in the DOM, there's going to be 0 or more instances of this block, and there's no way to look. They don't move anywhere else. It's not like you constructed them and then you put them here. It's either there or it's not there. And one nice thing about that is that you can sort of look at a template and you can get a sense by looking at the nesting structure what the output looks like, right? Like the if statement is always at the place where the true or false matters. The loop is at the place where you're putting in more than one thing. And because you're like nesting inside of like divs and ULs and LIs or whatever, it's pretty easy. You look at the interleaving structure and you see exactly what possible outcomes there are. And we don't have to literally run the code.
It's more constrained than an arbitrary expression.
Right. And for that reason, we don't have to literally run the code. We can just run the parts of the code that we conservatively think might have changed. And I think people underestimate, I've never figured out how to really, give the elevator pitch about this, but I think people underestimate how important it is to React that you are literally running all the code and that there's not really like a differentiation between the part of your, in the old view, the old part of your render function that is really about the output and the part that's really about data flow. And in the hooks world, there's like no differentiation between like the shape of your program and the output, right? And in the Haskell world, the React one is like way more monadic, but nobody has to know what that means.
I don't.
There's something you don't have to. I can say what I mean. What I mean is in the React world, you have a lot more control over what should happen next based on what happened before. Right? So in the React world, if you render a component, you could look at the component and you could decide to do something else based on what happened in the component. Basically all the data flow allows you to say, oh, let me look at this thing and now go generate a completely different virtual DOM.
Right.
Whereas in Ember, you have to say upfront what the shape is. Now the trick is that the upfront shape is described in terms of a general purpose programming language, so you could like have conditionals and loops. Right. But it's still not anything. It still requires you to say upfront what is possible. And like what that basically means is that, like, I've heard you guys talk about this as a performance issue before, and that like that's true. But I think React people usually say, yeah, whatever, I'll figure out the performance thing when I need it, and I have something to say about that. But I think it's also a understanding thing. Like I think looking at a program that's written in JSX and figuring out what even the shape could be is really hard. And looking at a template, even the template with a lot of conditionals and loops, and figuring out what the shape could be is pretty easy. And I think like I take the point that the way that we accomplish that is by creating too much of a forked world. Like I think that's like a historical artifact in a lot of ways. We can talk more about that. But I think it's not enough.
Why is that a value to you? Did that come from addressing a pain point, or is it just something that you think is important, like intrinsically? Like you want this thing to be understand. You think it's important for, so when I have been reading React programs that aren't written by me, the first thing I do is look at what's mounted in the render function. It's just like in a Rails app. Like, how do you understand a Rails app that you never wrote? You start with a route. You start with the entry point, and you follow that down. And exactly the same thing in Ember and even in React. You're going to look at the root component. You're going to see what's rendered. Okay, here's the thing. Okay, it has some data. Where is it getting it from? And then you worry about like click events later. But like that's how you analyze the thing. And so I agree having a separation there is useful. But just wondering like your thoughts on like why that's important to you.
So I like, if I'm going to be honest, I don't think it was highly philosophical.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think it.
That's valid. Yeah.
I try to figure out. let me put it this way. Ember had many opportunities to change a lot of things, like including multiple rewrites of the entire rendering layer. At one point, Pete Hunt, who was a React developer at the time, tried to convince us to use React as the rendering layer, and we could have done that. So I think that there are
multiple reasons why.
Yeah, all I'm trying to say is I don't think the answer is basically like sunk cost fallacy or something. I personally actually rewrote the whole thing multiple times, and I think if I thought that JSX was I did think that top-down rendering was better. So we rewrote everything. If I thought that JSX was better, then now I could be wrong about it. But I'm just trying to say that I don't. The explanation is not that I was stuck on what we already had.
Sure,
that's true.
Yeah, that's valid. And also, it's just making me think too. Like the whole idea here is that there's value in. Thomas mentioned this. You've mentioned this in keynotes about using deliberately underpowered technology. Rule of least power technology is kind of what we're talking about here, and the idea that your template or parts of your program are deliberately constrained so you can know more ahead of time. Well, that's actually making its way into React now. So with the suspense stuff, I haven't read through all the guides there, but there is a way for a component to basically tell an ancestor, I need data from this cache, and you don't have to render the whole thing to know ahead of time. You can actually basically pre-run it in some sense and know, and that's a similar idea.
Extremely charitable to what we don't know really what they're going to end up doing. But so I think one thing I want to say is we don't. I also have heard you talk about the rule of least power as a kind of eat your vegetables thing, and just saying I don't generally believe you eat your vegetables at all in any way. I think when rule of least power makes sense, it's when the alternatives are more annoying. And my feeling is that if you look at hooks have a lot of rules. There's literally the rules of hooks, and you need a linter, and they tell you think of use XXX as a syntax, right? And you still have to remember to put in your list of dependencies, and you still have to remember all these other quirks of the system. So to me, the rule of least power is useful if it helps you, if it constrains you in a way that alleviates some of those quirky problems. And my personal feeling is that people underestimate the amount of quirky problems in the React model. So the positive is you just write JavaScript wherever there's a JavaScript expression. And the negative is you have to learn the rule of hooks and the rules of composition and what a pure function is, and a ton of stuff. And I think people like learning it, so they undercount it, and maybe that counts. Maybe that's a good trick, right? But the Ember structure is not underpowered because I want to write a paper about it. It's underpowered because it is React people would be the first people to agree that part of the code has to be restricted, right? So the syntax is helping you remember what the restrictions are.
I think we're on the same page that the rule of least power is not something, it's not intrinsically valuable. It's not valuable if it's used for its own sake.
I think XSLT sucks, for example. And XSLT was one of the original rule of least power languages.
Got you.
Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, just kind of reflecting on what you were saying. For me, the things that I've struggled with the hooks actually don't have to do with the weird ways that there are rules around it, and that it's not just JavaScript or something. There are other pain points that are associated with me using hooks. So that stuff is not actually as important.
So you think that, but I think React gets away with a lot here because people can't always pin down the root causes of things. So
I haven't had the bugs. I can tell you the bugs I've had with my hooks code, whether I'm pairing with Brian, whether I'm pairing with people who have done React before, other developers who make a living teaching, who are good developers, and the bugs there are not about forgetting dependency.
No, it's stale state was one that you talked about a lot, right? But stale state, so it's.
And we talked about that, and that's the example of Ember choosing to use object references, so you never see. You put it in a nice way. You said you can never see unrendered state.
Yep. So I think I think it's a little, basically the reason it's a little tricky to talk about this stuff is that there's a bunch of constraints and you have to solve them some way. And I think people underappreciate how much the Ember syntax approach solves a lot of them. And they also underappreciate how many of them are created by the React syntactic approach. But so if I want to talk about the stale state problem, but the stale state problem on its own doesn't prove anything. But I think it's instructive. So the way that React decided to do stale state, both in the class model and in the hooks model, is that when you call set state without anything special, there's no model of the current state that the user has access to, right? So you think like people say it's just JavaScript, but like mutation is part of JavaScript. And the instant you start mutating something that could end up in the DOM, you don't have immediate access to the state of the world. The only kind of access you have is to a snapshot of the world at some point in the future.
Which could be stale at that point.
And there's a time window in between, right? So you set some state. Now there's a time window before you're allowed to look at the state, but there's other ways that you could happen to care about what the state is in the meantime. Like there are very obvious ones, like you use state and then you set it and then you just used it right afterwards, like that.
Send it over in a network request, the latest version.
But like you try to put it in the curly, right? Like they will try to catch some of those cases for you, but there's nothing like, I think you said last week, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. Like I'm just setting up my state. Like why should I have to model that as a default? Maybe I want to have a condition and now I want to say, I have a count and I want to say if some condition, then set count to some value. Like the law of hooks says you can't use state around in a conditional. And if you say set state, you talked about this exact thing last week. If you say set state, now you can't use it anymore. You have to think about how to model that time window, right? Now there's a lot going, there's a lot of things happening here for really no very good reason, other than the fact that the way that they decided to do things is that they're running the whole function every single time. The JSX is literally at the end. It's a return statement that literally uses local variables that are in the same location. And the way that it uses local variables in hooks is like literally by accessing them in JavaScript.
Scope. Yeah, in lexical scope.
Right? So they cannot intercept the fact that you accessed it at all. It's like literally impossible. And therefore, the consequence of the fact that it's just JavaScript in one sense, which is like, it's just a function that returns a JSX, which is like a JavaScript data structure, means that mutation became extremely not just JavaScript, right? Mutation always has a window of time where you have to wait for the state changes to settle before you can even see it. And then you have a use effect that exists just to see the change. And now you have to model the time window, right? Because now the JSX has to care about the fact where you don't have a count yet. You have to do something about that. Even though, why did that even matter in the first place, right? Whereas now, in Ember, the way that that's modeled is you're just allowed to use regular mutation, and there's a different piece of thing that is not literally inside of the function that takes the state and puts it in the right place. And like you quoted my tweet, there's no point at which you could even observe the time window in between the point where you mutated the state and when it took effect, which is not really a JavaScript concept. So anyway, that like I said in the first place, that doesn't prove anything. You could find a way to solve that problem with JSX. I think that one way is to use ref, but there's mobx is a way, etc. But I think there's a lot of, if you start digging, if I said that to somebody in a bar, they would tell me this is an edge case, I don't care, stop talking my ear off about philosophical things, right? But the reality is it's not a philosophical thing. It affects the basic usage of the primitives in hello world ways. And if you add enough of them up, then it stops being so clear that JSX is buying you what you think it's buying you. So that's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's part of that I agree with. There's part of it I disagree with. I think there's some of the rule stuff, and I think there's ways that React is surprising that don't have to do with some of those things that you mentioned. I think I've noticed as I've been learning React and Vue and written Ember for many years now, happily, written Ember for many years now. I think I've noticed that the ways in which the authors of these tools talk about things are sometimes disconnected from the real pain points that users feel. And, or GraphQL versus REST, as we've talked about before. And so, that's also been something that we've talked about in the past.
I should be clear about, like, there's a thing that I've said privately, but I should say here, which is, I think there's I'm Ember before Octane, certainly, but I want to talk about it first and then I'll talk about after Octane, has so many things that get in the way of, so I'm talking about a world where you basically have, have HTML declarative structure that talks about the structure of your output, and then you have some JavaScript that hangs on the side and gives you event handlers, gives you some state derivation. Maybe you have some helpers, which are JavaScript that sit on the side that serve the role of functions in a programming language, etc. But if you look at Ember classic components, even just the class name bindings, that set of things really took you so far from even a basic version of what I'm saying that it doesn't, the trade-off doesn't feel worth it. And I think one thing I don't want to no true Scotsman React and Ember here. I think we have to look at the real React and the real Ember. And I think it's definitely valid to take a look at Ember and say, that sounds nice, but the number of things I have to type is too high, that I call the annotation burden is too high. But I think it's possible to look at Octane and see that I said all that as a preface to, I think there's a world in which the Ember, if we think about the philosophical conflict, which is between the Hooks version, which is helpfully far on the side of, it's just a function that runs every single time, and there's not even any static, there's no classes, right? There's just functions that set up the world every time and figure out how to reconcile it with the last view of the world. That's one very extreme side of the declarative mindset. The other side of the mindset is the Ember world, where there's a declarative language which describes your output, and it has exit points back into JavaScript where you need to write imperative code, right? I think those are the philosophical poles. And I think even though it's ridiculous to say perfect Ember, perfect React, or whatever, I think we are heading in the direction of more clear,
the logical conclusions of the two models. Yeah.
Yes. So I think, for example, collocation, template collocation feels like a small feature. You put your template next to your component. It feels like, oh, you're just giving me a little tiny bit of what React has with JSX or whatever. And it's not the end of the story either. But even just that makes the story of you have a bunch of HTML and the JS is hanging off the side feel more true, right? And I think we'll end up, I think ultimately where we're going to end up is you can more easily, so today, if you want to write a helper, you have to put it in what is effectively a global location. And that means that writing a function feels expensive, right? In the purest sense, right? We have getters, which are getters and methods, which are basically the OO side of things. It's the use state of React, or the use ref. And then we have helpers, which are basically the functions of React. And right now using a helper feels really expensive. And I think it won't be before a year goes by, I think we'll have a way of writing helpers that are a lot, I don't know the exact details for sure, but maybe even in the same file as your template. And at some point it stops, there's a magic singularity line where it stops feeling like the trade-off is as harsh.
Right. That, just to make a point here, you had an interesting conversation with us a few weeks ago when we were talking about OOP and functional programming, and you were saying some of the specific decisions that landed in the design of ES classes that you specifically had an influence on were because you believe kind of in the power of a multi-paradigm, a hybrid approach. And so I think kind of, if I had to sum up what you were just talking about, and it's one way to answer, one way to say it is why isn't Yehuda Katz just writing React now? Why do you believe that a full embrace of the approach that they're taking still kind of leaves something to be desired, and you think that there's a better trade-off somewhere else along that curve? I think it's related to this, which is that, again, your influence on the design of ES6 classes means that we can have a hybrid approach. So can you talk a little bit about that? You specifically were talking about how in Ruby, doing something like importing a format date function from moment.js and just using it is like impossible. But like that's a beautiful thing that might be overlooked by a lot of JavaScript developers, how great we have that, basically.
Sure. So when I talk about multi-paradigm approaches, what I mean is that JavaScript classes are like, I think ES6 classes were basically derived from Smalltalk classes. Alan Wolfsbrock, who worked on them, was an old school Smalltalker. And there's things that you can see from there, like class side inheritance, which I think as a Ruby developer, you like just expect. But people come from C# or Java are like, what the hell is going on here, right? And for me, it's like why not? Why wouldn't it work? But from a person who comes from a more static O language, it feels weird. So we have I would say a pretty old school OO implementation in our class system. And then like we also have a module system, which doesn't look anything like anything Ruby has, right? A module system is basically just a new top level scope that has nothing in the scope. And you can import stuff that become variables that are available. Unlike Ruby, every single curly braces still has access to the stuff outside of it. So for example, if I import format date from moment, it's a local variable that's in my module. It doesn't have to be a global variable. It doesn't have to be a static thing on my class. It's just a local variable. And then I can just access it from any method inside. And I think for people who are thinking, duh, obviously, it's actually a pretty rare combination. It's not, Rust has it. It's not like not like no one does it, but the combination of classes that feel like classes that aren't like an FP hack of classes, plus real like functions that are lexically scoped that you import, and modules that have nothing to do, like in Ruby, if you want to access moment.js, you have to make a mixin because the only way to have access to something in your scope is to have it in the inheritance hierarchy, right? And that's a very extreme O view. And a very extreme FP view is like, what even is a class, right? Whereas JavaScript, again, it's not unique to JavaScript, but it's rarer than people think. JavaScript lets you have a class. I have a component class, and it also lets you import functions if you want to use them. And I think to the extent that I matter on TC39, I care a lot about making sure people who come from one paradigm or the other paradigm very often try to add features that break the, they sort of, I want to be as charitable as possible. They sort of assume that you're either a functional programming person or an OO person. And like, why would an OO person use pattern matching?
Sure.
Or why would a functional programming person use private state? Like those things are two different worlds. And like in some sense, what is the point of having a programming language that just is two programming languages smashed together? Like at some point, they should really.
Two ways of you either use closures to hide variables, or you use private.
And there are people who think about it. There are people who think about it like that, and that is how React thinks about it, right? It's like use state is like weirdly they're like modeling fields using a global variable to make it more functional, like, and that I control it, but it's taking a perspective that classes are wrong. Right? That if you need state, global variable, totally fine. Runtime, totally fine. Mutable object, basically fine. Classes, very, very bad. Right? And my reaction to the hooks thing is if you want a thing that has, like, if you want a stable thing that has state on it, like, we have a pattern for that. That's what a class is. It doesn't have to do everything. If you want a function, you should make a function. It's JavaScript. We can get away with that. But like, if you need a bunch of methods that deal with some state and you want to be able to mutate the state and you want it to be relatively stable, which is like what hooks are doing for you with the runtime, like you could do worse than just use the class pattern. People know what it is.
Mm-hmm. Again, I think here there's something going on where like there's a lot of technical underpinnings to this discussion, but then when you talk to a day-to-day developer using hooks, what they're excited about is the composition that it unlocks. And I don't really think it has anything to do with the fact that it's a function.
Yep. Let me try to be really charitable here. So first of all, I think the biggest, you asked earlier, like, what are big important things that I think React did? I don't know if React exactly gets credit for this, but it certainly changed my personal prioritization somewhat. I think the thing that Hooks really does for you that very little in the existing ecosystem does in as nice a way is what Ember Concurrency calls lifetime entanglement, which basically is, if you, like, what is the point of, like, use Apollo or use remote data, as you said a month ago? What is the point of that? Why is that a special thing? And really the only thing that's really special about it is that anything that you call use blah, blah, blah inside of another thing called use blah, blah, blah gets its teardown logic called whenever the parent thing's teardown logic gets called. And I think it will prove to be extremely important that there's a nice way in React. There's a mystery that I was trying to solve. I said this to you privately, which is, okay, so I know about a whole bunch of problems with hooks that really suggest that there are challenges. That doesn't mean that they're failing, but these are challenges. On the other hand, all of a sudden there's like a million hook libraries that exist for like all kinds of things. And they're all like, they're not all about DOM. They're not all about data. They're about a lot of things. And I was like, what is the reason, the mystery I was trying to solve is, what is the reason that hooks allowed all these things to suddenly exist? It's not, React creates a lot of things. React created context, and context didn't suddenly become a solution to every problem. What is it that React hooks are doing that is really enabling a lot of things that were hard before? And like, more or less what I concluded is that the thing that's really good about, the thing that hooks lets you do is it lets you have teardown logic that runs at like, quote unquote, approximately the right time. And if you actually, I'm not saying that's the only thing that hooks do, obviously, but I think if you look at any tutorials, any talks that talk about hooks, and people who get into the philosophical, people who try to talk about, like, try to figure out why, what people end up saying is, like, I thought use remote data like a month ago or something, one of you said something like, well, you could have use fetch. You're talking about Ryan Florence. And the other one said, no, it would be called use remote data. And that was like very, that's like an encapsulation for me of everything. Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's not, the name doesn't matter, but it tells you that you're talking about a noun. The thing itself has a life cycle of its own, but you want it to be able to get removed, torn down, whatever, as soon as you are torn down, so that things are not just floating around in the ether. And I think, like you started to say, and I agree with, people React people always try to find explanations for why things are happening. And I think the React community is actually like okay at it, but the React core team often has explanations that are not super in touch with what is exciting. And I think what happens, like what's exciting about the compositionality of hooks is not that they're functions. It's not that you can copy and paste code. These are all like interesting characteristics of the system. But what's exciting about it is that if you make a quote unquote hook and you use it from another hook, when the parent hook gets destroyed, gets torn down, the child hook can get torn down. And that's why I really recommend that people look at Kent Dodd's video where he talks about abortable fetches, where he basically shows, well, here's like, I think it's called like, it's like React hooks, what is disappointing or something like that. And then he's like, well, first of all, there's nothing disappointing. It's great. And I'm like, okay, this is a React talk. I see what I'm getting myself into. But his point was there's like two ways to think about it, right? One way to think about it is it's just a bunch of lifecycle hooks, just like before, written in a different syntax. And indeed, you're not going to get anything out of it. But another way to think about it is that it's a way of composing the lifecycle in a more natural way. I'm butchering his actual argument here. But the thing that was great about it is that he shows you that you could sort of like, what's interesting about abort is that you want to attach abort to teardown. And what's interesting about that is that you want that teardown to be attached to the teardown of the thing that contains it, etc.
Component, right?
Right, and that I think that's
one of the first things that we did when we were starting to do data fetching with hooks was like we wrote like a use.
I think we called it use fetch, but should be use remote.
Use cancelable promise or something where you could basically pass in a promise and you return it at each step and bail out if the component's been unmounted. You basically check if is mounted is true, something like that, right?
Right. And I think what Kent shows you is that if you're doing a lot of checking about when the component is mounted or not, you're like probably doing something wrong. But on the other hand, it's like,
on the other hand, you don't have an option today for it, but it's true that it's the reason it's annoying is because there's something that's fundamentally in disagreement with the paradigm, because
I think it's good for
the more your API looks like subscribe to Firebase and that's it, and then clean up on unsubscribe and you don't have like a .then or anything like that, then the better it's going to play with like.
Yes, I think it's good for the React ecosystem that people are like, I don't care that it should be called use remote data. I know how to think about use fetch and I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
I think the React core team underestimates how important that dynamic is.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, you said a lot there. Yeah, you have something to say, Ryan?
Do you think so with JSX and handlebars, whatever, we get declarative rendering. Do you think that hooks are kind of like the declarative version of JavaScript with, the way we compose them, the way we write them, like, use resource, use remote data? Do you think that's like something that hooks can unlock and all of a sudden?
So I think as you guys have been saying for a few weeks, I think that is like a vision that some people have and it doesn't feel like it's coherent. I would recommend that people go back and listen to you worked through a lot of the details and it's going to be hard to repackage here, but
condense our pain into, a few hours of listening pleasure.
I think, I think that so I think that's right. I think it's good to think of hooks as, like I said before, the logical pole, the logical extreme of rebuilding everything every time. Let me try to say what I mean by that. So I think the way that the React world works, like the React worldview works, is that you have a program, you run the program, and then the output of the program is what ends up on the screen, right? And then if you want to change something, you run the program again. And the result of running the program again gets put on the screen. And I think when people are thinking about React in a very happy, purist, philosophical way, that is the worldview that they have. It is the worldview that works, is good. However, the class world had this weird disconnect where the classes themselves got created and then they stuck around. And it was very important that they had identity, right? So in order to understand what a React program did, you couldn't think, I'm just going to run the program again, and then I'll get a bunch of new components. You really had to understand that you were getting the same component again the second time around. And you could store state on that, and you could do whatever you want. And that would matter. And it mattered a lot to people. I think what hooks are doing is they're saying, you actually are building your classes as you're rendering, right? So use state is basically creating a field. And it's saying, as I'm rendering, as I'm going through my hooks, I'm literally creating my classes in line, and React is effectively telling me what features of classes I'm allowed to have. I'm allowed to have state. I'm allowed to have effects. I'm allowed to have whatever.
Yeah, they're stateful. They're just not going to be changing over time because really the class is going to be thrown away and recreated.
The class is thrown away, and you get to have a window to the classes that were created. So they're not stable. You can't actually rely on the identity of the class instance. You can rely on the React runtime definition of what the identity is. And every single, basically what React is doing for you is every single time you run the program, now it literally is running the program. It's literally building the classes as you go. And from that perspective, you can see why you can't have conditional use state or use effect, because then basically you're going to end up creating a different class. It really is important that what you're creating has the same static shape.
It's two different programs.
Right? You need the same static shape. Now, again, my opinion is just use a fucking class. We spent a lot of time over decades figuring out how to describe the difference between the instantiated state of something and its logical shape. That is called a class, right? But like putting aside my ranting about what they're doing, I think the way to think about it is it's doubling down a lot on the idea that you can think about what's going on really as you're running the whole program every single time. And the rules of hooks are really just about telling you, we're going to make sure that so there's a logical gap between those two things, right? There's a logical gap where if you run the program every time and you like conditionally use state, then there's React can't fit together the static shape. So we're going to use some syntactic rules, some lints, whatever, to make sure that we eliminated the gap between running the program every time and like having a static instance, like having a real instance. And I think that works okay as far as it works, but it's like a lot of mental gymnastics to accomplish what they're trying.
Again, for me, okay, when you hear them talk about the rules of hooks in a conference talk, you're like, that sounds weird, right? It's a little scary or something or confusing. But when you're actually writing React, that's not the problem. The problem.
No, I don't think it's a problem.
The problem is the parts of your program that are not yet represented like declaratively, and so in the same way that the JavaScript UI development community had to learn why $.slide down was wrong, like that was not intuitive to anyone who was writing jQuery UI code in 2010.
Yeah.
$.slide down was wrong. Instead, you want to have it is open state and then re-render. So that's where we are right now, in the sense that when I say click on the to do and mark it completed and then save it, and then on a then callback set is loading to false, like that's those two steps of imperative code. How would I even think about given this state of the program, run that logic? Right?
Yeah, I'm trying to disagree with, I know what you're trying to argue. I'm trying to disagree with some subtle part of it, which is you guys have both been pushed.
I just don't think it's about the design. I don't think it's some of the design decisions are what's like.
I don't think they are. I think there's a conflict. There's a push and pull between, so maybe there's a one side of the argument, which I think Sam has usually been making, is that there's a perfect future world that is like Ryan Florence's future perfect world, where everybody learns all the stuff. And then once you learn all the stuff, it is coherent, it works. And really all we have to do is get everyone on the same page. That's one side. The other side, which usually has been represented by Ryan, is no, if you actually take that to its logical conclusion, it will be in conflict with itself. And I am basically taking Ryan's argument. I think basically that it's, so you said the is loading thing. One thing that really sucks about that is that it creates a lot of extra states that you have to manage that didn't exist before, right? So we were talking about, let's talk about use state and then conditionally setting state and then use effect to see the results of that. And then you return a JSX, right? That's a very simple, I made a onion cutting joke on Twitter the other day about it, right? That actually creates a window of time where the very first render has to include a thing that doesn't logically exist.
For sure. 100%. I'm on board with you there.
I just think that's an error. I think that's it's the logical conclusion of what Ryan is saying. It's the Ember observer worldview. And I think it just creates a lot of, it creates some batching windows that didn't need to exist. And now the fact that they existed actually creates more complexity in your code. Yeah. And I think that's bad.
Interesting. All right, let's change topics a little bit. So while we were on the topic of classes and modules, we had this is a small point, but I just want to ask you because you're here and I'm curious and confused about it still. Are imports code? Are they declarations? Is it okay to think about imports inlined? Module order, run order, is all of this stuff.
Okay, so first of all, I want to disagree with things that I don't remember who said in a previous episode, but
probably me.
But it is not true that the correctly implemented ES6 module, I don't want to say algorithm, that makes it sound too complicated, results in a very different thing than CommonJS. So in CommonJS, I'm not saying it's identical. I'm just saying the things that you were complaining about. So in CommonJS, if I say require X, require Y, require Z in a file, and some other code required Y already, I see X and Z. I am not allowed to rely on X, Y, and Z running in exactly that order because someone else could have already required Y somewhere else. That is true about CommonJS.
Okay, that's true about CommonJS.
Like, of course it is, right?
Okay,
Like,
yeah.
The only alternative is that the same module gets required multiple times. Right.
That is the only. Yeah.
Yes. Now, that is important. And it is the reason that it is not true that you can rely on XYZ running in that order in any system that has singleton modules. But however, there is a thing that you could say about CJS that is also supposed to be true about JavaScript modules, which is that if you see require X, Y, Z, if X, Y, and Z have not already been required or imported at the point at which you started evaluating that module, the order of evaluation will be X, Y, and Z. I have to add more caveats, like assuming that X didn't import Y, whatever. Right?
Yeah, right.
But assuming that none of X, Y, assuming you didn't already import X, Y, and Z before you entered this module, and assuming X, Y, and Z didn't import each other, it actually is supposed to be guaranteed that in ES modules, X, Y, and Z evaluate in that order. If you put console.logs at the top of each of those files, you are supposed to see them running in that order.
Okay, so in our case, when we had X, Y, and Z, but Y was pretender and roll up inlined X and Z, and it ended up running after pretender, let's say.
It's not supposed to happen.
Right. I understand why it does, thinking about basically what we told rollup to do, which was essentially telling them to do that, like roll up all of our modules, right? But it had this effect.
It didn't have to do it. So basically, like the conversation on Twitter revealed, and I already sadly knew this, what's actually happening is that rollup has decided to prioritize an optimization that they would like to do over correctness. And they, for reasons that I can't figure out who is exactly to blame here, but for some reason, the two of you came to the conclusion that it was the ES6 module spec was tying Rich Harris's hands. And that is not what's happening. Rich Harris is choosing to violate the ES6 module spec in order to achieve an optimization that he thinks is worth it. And he thinks that the correct thing for you to do is to not rely on it. And that's like really not JavaScript's problem. Like we already saw this and we didn't want the outcome that you experienced. So we expected to not do that.
I see. We should have had this conversation yesterday because we were just having a beer with Rich Harris last night.
I think he would agree.
Got you. So
what about like, what are your thoughts on like CJS kind of gives you access to the module systems, so you can, you have like require dot cache, and I can go in there and I can like remove things and re-require them and get the module to run again.
So I think it's important to differentiate between what ES6 actually says and what naturally has to be layered on top of it for it to make sense. So what ES6 says is, here is import syntax, and here is the definition of linking. And what linking means is if you parse an ES6 module, you see a bunch of imports and exports spots. Before you even start evaluating it, you can create spots in the sky for every export for that module. And then when somebody else, some other module imports from that module, they are just pointing at the spot in the sky. They're not pointing at a value. And as long as the other module runs and fills in the spot in the sky before you ran, you can't tell. Works like a regular JavaScript variable. The reason that you sometimes can tell is cycles. And basically while the spot in the sky hasn't been filled in, you're supposed to get an error. In real native modules, you get one. In a lot of, in rollup, webpack, whatever, you don't always get one. So it sometimes feels like, why did I get undefined? That seems like an annoying thing about cycles. In the real spec, you're supposed to get a good error. I mean, the spec doesn't care about how good the error is, but you're supposed to get an error that says you're trying to access something. So the common case that comes up is like you have a class that has that subclass is some other thing, and that other thing has like a class method that instantiates the child thing or something like that, right? And if you try to do that in the wrong order, what's supposed to happen is you get an error. But that's really like a thing CJS can't even do. Right? CJS just fails. It like can't, basically what JavaScript is doing, what it's adding is like this idea of a new variable that's like in the sky and can be filled in at some time. You can like approximate it with rollup and let variables and whatever, but that's like what's interesting about it. So if you eliminate cycles, it's like nothing interesting. And if you add cycles, then it's like it works in more cases than in strictly more cases than CJS.
Interesting.
Okay. So let me answer the question. So that's like what JavaScript says. Then there's another question, which is like, okay, that assumes that I actually know when you say import blah, blah, blah from moment, like what is moment? And the JavaScript spec doesn't actually tell you how you're supposed to know that. It tells you how to the spec says how to parse a module and know that you're expecting moment, but it doesn't tell you how to get moment. So basically, Webpack, Rollup, but also the browser, what they do is they have an extra system layered on top that says, okay, when you ask for moment, there's like in the spec, there's a hook that's like, please get me moment for this source for this refer. And you are supposed to return back a module record in the spec, right? And like as a practical matter, the way to think about it, if you're not trying to do anything fancy, is you just have to return the source code of another module, right? And I think that's like, now that we got into that, now there's a question, okay, like how, like what is that? And basically it's up to the individual implementations according to the JavaScript spec, like what that is. And there's a standardized spot to put features, functionality about that called import.meta. So you can say like import.meta.entries if you want. And any host, that's like special syntax that can be filled in by implementations of module systems however they want. And finally, there's some de facto standards like URL or whatever that are like trying to get people to be able to write universal JavaScript using this feature. Did that answer your question, Ryan?
Yeah, I think so. Do you see a world where like in user land we're writing these resolvers? That's when you're describing this, that's what kind of came to mind, or a resolver. I think I would expect Node to have it, and at least where we've been at for a while on the browser side is that the browser is worried about having to run. I think they're wrong, but I'm also not a browser implementer. They're worried about letting you write arbitrary JavaScript to intercept every import. And so there's like this feature called EmberMap, which allows you to it's kind of like Yarn's resolution. Oh, it's the version that Ryan had in mind is like method missing. This is more like a Yarn resolution map, which basically just says, hey, if you encounter like import like this top level module, here's where you can find it. If you see the bare word jQuery, find jQuery at this URL. So it's like a hash instead of having code?
More or less.
Okay.
And I think the reason I said all that was just to say, I think the JavaScript spec doesn't care, and it is important to the JavaScript spec that rollup and Webpack can exist without having to answer those questions. And I think observably, like if I said that 3 years ago or 4 years ago, somebody might have said, cool story, like that doesn't make any sense. But I think the reality shows that we can have a huge amount of ES6 modules in the world and like totally punt on the question of how you're supposed to get them. And still it like largely works out.
Yep, for sure. Okay, so just to wrap that up, it is true that, and just kind of going back to I'm kind of coming down a level here, just imports. Something I learned on that podcast episode where we talked about that was like, it's not the same as the JavaScript expression. I like the way you just described it. It's like a point in the sky. Basically, you can look at a main file and follow import and export statements and learn a lot about the program without running it. And that's an important part of it.
Yes, and people will often say stuff like, we already had a module system, it was called CJS or whatever, and they are like losing the fact that really a goal of the module system was to be able to figure out the entire module graph just by reading the files. Which
and we're not doing
turns out to be which turns out to be very important for bundles, right? Like basically Webpack and Rollup could not exist. Browserify existed and had all kinds of problems, right? I think.
Sure. I mean, that was the whole reason Rollup was created in the first place. It was like deliberately constrained, just focusing on the ES6 module case because of the static nature of it. That was the whole point.
It has nothing to do with async, right? We didn't even mention async in this entire conversation.
Sure. Cool. Interesting. Okay, another one for you.
Wait, can we pause for one sec? Yehuda, I know we only booked you to 5, but are
I'm
you able
fine.
to keep going? Okay,
Yeah, I'm
awesome.
good.
Let's do it.
Cool. Let me check my like. Okay, I have like 120 gigs still, so I think this is all working. Got another one for you. I think this is an interesting one. So you wrote this back in the CoffeeScript days. CoffeeScript was running into syntax collisions with the JavaScript language, and you wrote like a comment on like a discuss forum somewhere that was basically making the argument why this is a problem, and why using something like Babel, 6 to 5 at the time, was like okay, and not going to run into this in the same way that CoffeeScript was. I think it was like a very influential thing. I remember seeing it going around a lot. And
sounds nice. I don't know if it was influential. I wrote it. It influenced the discourse team.
And it wasn't that you were. Again, it was just you were just making a point, because I think a lot of us were confused at the time we saw CoffeeScript. We saw other things like the whole compiler transpiler thing was starting, and it was like, is this?
Yep.
Is someone gonna get bit? People are getting bit by CoffeeScript basically. And you made the point that, in 6 to 5 and now Babel is explicitly targeting future things. Now we all know, obviously, the ecosystem is much more mature, and using something like stage 0 feature is introducing some risk to your code base, because you could be introducing stuff that you're relying on that's never going to be JavaScript, and so it might have to go away. But
and you're going to have to figure out how to transition out.
Right. But if something is accepted, if ES6 classes, fat arrows are accepted in the language and just not implemented yet, that's obviously much less risky to use via a transpiler. Okay, so we just saw that there was a recent TypeScript release that has this optional chaining on it.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have their own decorators and things like this. So we wanted to ask about all that. And does TypeScript fall into the same camp as the CoffeeScript woes? Should we think differently about this? Yeah,
I need to be careful here. Not because I just want to be precise. So just to recap the argument I gave at the time, the argument basically was CoffeeScript had features like for of syntax, and it was like the semantics of for of was literally, if it's an array, transpile it to the expected loop. Otherwise, it has no meaning. They also had features like class with extends that did things like copy all the properties over instead of inheriting them. So there was all these features that they had the same syntax as ES6 at the time, ES 2015 eventually, but they didn't have the same semantics. And what I said at the time was, like CoffeeScript, you have two choices. You could either, for compatibility, stick with the semantics that you have now, but that's eventually going to become very confusing, because the whole point of CoffeeScript is that it looks like JavaScript. So if someone writes some for of and they're talking about an iterable, it would be very surprising that it wouldn't work. Or option B is you could migrate your semantics to JavaScript semantics, in which case you're going to have a constant flood of breaking changes every single time your preferred syntax happens to collide with the semantics of the final feature. Right, so that was roughly the argument. I think I have been proved right about this argument. I personally think that if CoffeeScript wanted to keep existing, a good CoffeeScript 2 would have been a principled attempt to try to use only to use syntax that isn't going to collide, right? So just don't for of sounds nice, but since it could exist, what was especially problematic was that TC39 was like, oh, that's a cool CoffeeScript feature. We should adopt that syntax, right? But then we would because
change the semantics
because we could do better.
Yeah, sure.
CoffeeScript can't make iterables, but we can.
Right.
So it just, I think, fundamentally didn't work out.
It was set out on a bad path in a sense.
Right. Now they could, I think a thing they could have done is try to find sigils or other syntax strategies. So a thing that TypeScript did, and there have been other cases, is tell TC39, hey, we're writing a language that's compile future JavaScript. Can you please reserve some syntax that you will remember not to use unless we really discuss it? So, for example, anything after a colon, any new syntax after a colon in JavaScript is effectively reserved as type syntax now. And that doesn't mean that JavaScript will never use it for anything, but it means it's a big deal for JavaScript to use it for something probably wouldn't happen unless it was something type B.
Right.
And so like CoffeeScript just didn't do that. Right. So
they weren't working closely with the designer, with the.
They saw themselves as like activists, right? Like they're like, you guys are slow and we're doing the thing. Okay. So that problem is very serious. I think there were a few. You mentioned a few different TypeScript things, and I think we have to separate them. So first of all, the optional chaining feature is just a stage 3 feature.
Okay.
And, TypeScript in general now doesn't ship very unstable features. TypeScript is on TC39, and in general, the question of when TypeScript ships something is an important factor that we consider. In particular, I think TypeScript tries to follow the rule that every other implementation follows about not shipping features until they're in stage 3. I personally think that's a little too conservative. I think what Babel does, which is to ship features with a clearly demarcated stage 2 experimental flag, is sufficient. And at some point, we really do need people to do some amount of that to get user feedback. So my like big picture view here is we really need more user feedback. User feedback when something lands in a browser is a crippling thing. So we really need people to try stuff out in stage 2. And that is a risky thing. The whole point of user feedback is maybe we will discover things we need to change. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the user feedback in the first place. So if you use stage 2 features, that could have some consequences. But the idea, at least my perspective on the stage system, is that every increase in stage number is communicating to some group of people. We agree that now is a good time to invest, and we're gonna try to help you out. We're telling you to please try this out. Therefore, we're gonna try not to make too many big changes now that aren't really warranted, whatever. So that I think optional chaining is just a stage 3 feature.
Okay.
A big part of it going into stage 3 was that TypeScript was can you please make it stage 3 so we can ship it? So I think that is a thing. Decorators is just a really old feature. I think I don't even really want to talk about the details here. I've talked about it a bunch of times, but basically Angular decided to have a fork of JavaScript called @script a long time ago. TypeScript was like, hey, forks of JavaScript are bad. How about you use TypeScript and we'll try to get this feature into JavaScript. At that point, I worked on it. I'm still working on it. That was 2013. I think at that time, there wasn't even really a stage system to speak of, or it was very new. And we also didn't have a very strong sense that we should use stage 2 as a user study thing. Decorators also really ran up. There are some implementers who really want classes to be this ultra static thing that they can optimize, and
right,
really rubs them the wrong way. That they in their head they're the dynamic guys, go again.
Right. Chris Garrett had a lot of good stuff to say when we interviewed him about all this, so it's coming back to me now. Basically, the decorators that almost made it through were a little too dynamic, and that's kind of what you're talking about.
And I think that's the most charitable interpretation is they were a little too dynamic. I think I'm personally a little frustrated that we got all the way through stage 2 with basically no feedback, only to hear that at the very tail end, and then we have to reboot. But whatever, sometimes that happens. I hope we all learn from those things. But basically, TypeScript landed decorators well before, like you said, the ecosystem wasn't very mature. I think TypeScript landed decorators at a point where the ecosystem wasn't very mature, and never ever wants to land stage 1 features like that again. So I think you should think of decorators as being a pretty unique thing.
Okay, so in general, it's going to be more like the optional chaining, where basically there's not a lot of risks. There's not a lot of that kind of risk.
I think you should know what, if you're going to use a feature, TypeScript doesn't ship stuff until stage 3, so that's pretty reliable. TypeScript effectively is telling its users, we're taking on their churn risk for you. If you use Babel, I think it's really important to know what stage something is in. Stage 2 is, I think, a pretty good time to try stuff out, but only with the caveat that you understand that you're trying out a thing as part of a test. You are part of the user test. That is what you're signing up for.
Right.
I think that's good.
Right.
I like being.
Yeah, you think that's the reality of it, but it's also not something that's super scary. It's just something that you can.
And I think
You can change part of your code base. You can isolate it. You don't have to bet a whole business on it.
Yes. And you maybe will write code mods or are using something that people have told you they'll write code. So I personally, when I talk about things on TC39, my general feeling about stage 2 is to try to defend people who use stage 2 features. Sometimes people say, why do we do that? That's too bad on them. We'll change it. And I'm like, no, well, we really did ask people to invest in it. On the other hand, I think it's pretty important that we are getting the feedback from the stage 2 process and really incorporating it into the design. So I think it's okay, but I think adopting a stage 1 feature is extremely risky. Just so people know, it is almost impossible to block a stage 1 entrance, because all stage 1 means is everybody agrees that this problem space is worth exploring.
I see. That's good to know, because I didn't really know that. And I'm usually pretty hands off when it comes to all this configuring Babel and stuff. I just kind of do what people tell me to do, or what boilerplates say. So
can we walk through those? So what stage 1 is, it's worth exploring. What is stage 2?
I will give caveat. I'm giving you Yehuda's opinion, and for various reasons.
That's what everyone's here for.
I'm just saying, I'm not an authority, because this is we're in process
my authority
territory. I'll give you my opinion. So my opinion is stage 0 is, hey, TC39, I just want to let you know that I'm working on this. I have nothing specific to say other than to let you know I'm working on it. There is not even an entrance criteria for that. It's just means that stage 0 means the same thing as I have given a presentation at TC39. Stage 1 is, I have written a presentation that clearly communicates what problem I'm trying to solve. And I have gotten feedback from the committee about roughly what shapes of the solutions are worth exploring and what challenges there will likely need to be resolved before reaching stage 2. Very often, someone, I would say even more often than not, someone comes to the committee and they say, I'm trying to solve the problem of immutable data structures in JavaScript. And here is the reason why it matters, whatever. And here is my solution. More often than not, people say, I don't really like your solution, and I think it has all these challenges. I agree that we should solve the problem, but you really need to revisit. A good example of this actually is protocols and mixins, where people said, we need to do something in this space, but you need to do a lot more work because this is not quite right. So when something gets into stage 1, and the reason I say it's almost impossible is that it's almost always possible to phrase the motivation in a way that is sufficiently broad that everybody has no choice but to agree it's worth exploring. And so usually what I try to do as a TC39 member is be really clear about what problem we're trying to explore, right? But sometimes I'm not there, or I didn't pay enough attention, or I didn't, or someone who has my point of view didn't speak up, and you end up with, there's not a good enough distinction in the proposal between the motivation and the solution. So it looks like the thing that is the proposal is at stage 1. And I guess what I'm saying is, at least from my perspective, there's no such thing as a concrete proposal being at stage 1. There's only such a thing as a problem space being at stage 1 with a strong man.
Which is why you wouldn't lend much credence to a particular solution in stage 1, because it really doesn't mean the community has signed off on really anything.
And I can only think of a handful of cases. I think a case where something made through pretty much unaltered is the object spread operator.
Got you.
And even that was many meetings where we were is it has one property? Is it enumerable?
Right.
Whatever. And I think we ended up with the I fought pretty hard for it's the same thing as object.assign, which I think was the right thing. But even that was not a guarantee at all, and it was a very simple thing.
Right.
A thing that was
the
actually
semantics could have changed a lot from when it was.
I think whether undefined is an error actually was something that it matters a lot. That's not an edge case. I think being able to splat in a possibly undefined hash into a ... is a thing that matters a lot idiomatically, and it was not a guarantee until pretty close to the end. So basically stage 1 just means we're trying to solve a problem. Here's a straw man, so you don't think I'm just making up a problem that can't be solved. Stage 2, the entrance of stage 2 is okay, I have addressed all the things that people told me I need to address, and here is a spec text for the solution. It is not required to be literally the identical solution as we will ship, but it has to be well fleshed out, and it has to be. And when people agree to it, they're more or less agreeing that this rough shape is what we're actually shipping. So, like, that's really a good time to do a Babel transformation. It's a good time to use a Babel transformation, right? Because that time period between 2 and 3 is when we say, okay, so like everyone agrees that we're doing a syntax that looks like ... whatever in curly braces. And now we have to know, like, what is it? Has on proper? Is it enumerable? What should we do to undefined? And how do we answer those questions is like what people use. Like, do people try to, like, how often does it end up happening that someone tries to refactor object not assigned to that thing? And how often does it matter? How many, like, we look at the bugs that people file on GitHub issues for these Babel plugins, right? So if a lot of people say, I was very confused by this detail, then that matters a lot and we'll like want to address it. So that, like, in some ways we have no choice, but we really do need people to use those plugins. And I think personally, I really hope that more and more we do user testing roughly that way. And then when something enters stage 3, it's more or less saying, now is a good time for like browsers to try to implement the feature, which is it's pretty expensive for browsers to implement stuff. And so like, we want to make sure there's not going to be any significant changes left. I think there's some disagreement about what changes are even acceptable. My personal view of it is that any changes that couldn't have been logically figured out beforehand, and only came to the surface because people used it in a browser are like in play. So for example, like class fields are in stage 3, and like periodically people try to raise objections to the concept of class fields. And I'm just like, this is not a stage 3 concern.
Yeah.
Right? Like we really, all we need to figure out right now is like whether they're slow or whether like it turns out that there's some interaction between them and like a DOM feature.
Right.
And I happen to have a more expansive, like you can see that I'm pretty narrow. I have a slightly more expansive view than like browser implementers who really want to be able to say only we get to change it.
Right.
I think that's wrong. I think it could happen that like developers figure something out from the fact that it was implemented. But I'm not saying everybody should wait. I'm saying it really should logically have flowed from the fact of implementation. So web compat is a good example, right? Like you really sometimes don't know if something is web compatible until you try to ship it.
Right. For sure. That makes sense. Right. So by the time you're in stage 3, the kinds of risks that come from using a stage 2 or even a stage 1 feature are like someone makes a compelling argument that this is not actually a good thing to have in JavaScript. And those kinds of arguments are not typically made for things in stage 3. Those are already done. Those have happened.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think there's a strong sense on the committee to disallow those things. People try them, but they don't succeed. I think stage 2 is still a bit of a no man's land in terms of the exact norms. My personal opinion is that when something gets into stage 2, this is a bad feature in JavaScript, is a very like antisocial thing, but it is like.
And you also have this kind of quid pro quo where you want people to feel confident enough trying with, and you'll make the promise to help them as much as you can too, because you really benefit of real feedback. I
think we need to get some agreement about some of these details, but I think there's a rough sense of it, and I think in stage 2, it's like. Stage 3, it's very unlikely that like anything changes really. In stage 2, what the kind of things that could change are like undefined is no longer allowed in ... And that kind of thing could matter a lot to you.
Right.
So I think like you need to be aware of that risk. But I don't think like, it turns out we don't want object spread after all. Like that's an antisocial thing to do in stage 2.
Right. Okay, bringing it back to UI development here. You talked about whole apps. You had this I forget exactly if it was a side conversation.
I retweeted somebody recently about it.
But I really liked that it was this idea, and again, that kind of comes back to some of the stuff we were talking about at the very beginning, and again, some of the stuff that's been most influential to me, attacking the whole problem. You know, I see this in Rails. I see this in Laravel. It's like almost like the backpacker thing is kind of like the fun version of this, which is like, we care about someone being successful with this tool from beginning to end, like design, development, databases, like you're building a whole app. And I think that's been a big part of like Ember's API is about including a data layer, about all of these things that enable people to build whole apps and think about the whole piece. And yeah, so I guess I just wanted to, I'm trying to remember what my actual question was around here.
I mean, so far you did a good job of expressing what I already believe.
Right. Okay. My question was, what do you think's missing from UI development? Because I think, yeah, that's kind of the question.
Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I want to say a thing I think is not it, and I think it takes up a disproportionate amount of oxygen. Actually, there's two things. One of them is I don't think paradigm chasing is it. And what I mean by that is I don't like, as much as I think there's things to learn from the Hooks API, I don't think the shape of the Hooks API versus the shape of a class API is like fundamentally what's going to make UI programming easier, better, more fun, whatever.
By the way, I just want to say I agree with you there. As much as we've been critical of Ember on the podcast, and we've also talked about the things that we like, and we've been critical of other frameworks and talked about the things that we like. And I think it's very fascinating, everything that's going on in JavaScript over the past 5 years. But also, again, I talk to my friends who are Laravel developers, and they're writing PHP, and I think that's a great example of what you just talked about, just grinding through the last 10 to 20% to make it so that rendering a 404 page is very easy, or doing authentication in your app is very easy, even though you're using PHP, right? Which is not a new paradigm, but it's this higher level of thing that is enabling the whole app. So I just wanted to say, yeah, that's what I just wanted.
Yeah, and I'm not a nihilist here. I don't think we're all wasting our, some people say that. It's probably the most popular thing to say on Twitter is because someone could be successful with PHP, what are we all doing? I think that's incorrect. But I also Fred Brooks, No Silver Bullet, I quoted a lot. I don't think he got every detail right, more and more, but I think the point that he's trying to make at a big picture is you aren't the problems that you have building apps are mostly not from complexity caused by code structure. They're mostly caused by complexity that is imposed on you from the outside, like regulations or the business requirements, taxes, right? Every app, Skylight spends a huge amount of its time just tracking the app that I work on, tracking Rails, and we don't have any control over Rails. So we could be using Haskell and we would still have that problem. So that's his point. And I think generally speaking, I think there's a difference between paradigms and abstractions. I think paradigms, there are a few of them. It's functional programming, object-oriented programming. There's ML modules. There's monads, whatever. I'm not trying to say that these are the only paradigms in the world. There's FRP, right? There's a few paradigms that I'm defining them as a thing you could spend your career as an academic looking into, thinking about. And then there's abstractions that are more domain specific. They could get very high. They could get very abstract, but they aren't necessarily general purpose. There are things like making it easier to have a 404 page.
Right. Fundamentally different ways of solving the problem.
Right. And I think abstractions could do something that feels very paradigm-y, which is an abstraction could give people a way to think about the problem that allows them to share code better. But abstractions tend to be a little more fragile than paradigms, because abstractions are they're talking about the world as it is now, right? A paradigm is about math. It's about the code, the math of your code. And Fred Brooks's point was there's only so much blood to wring out of that stone, there's only so much math. But abstractions are HTTP2 came out. How do we take advantage of that? It's
they're unlimited in a sense. They keep building up, and
they could last for a while. Rails is a very successful abstraction that lasts a decade or more. But fundamentally, an abstraction, like the router abstraction in Ember, it's talking about solving a problem now. which is we have push state. We really want the ability to have URLs that aren't only driven by server reloads. That's not a math problem, right? That's a now problem. And I think like that's a long-winded way of saying, I think that the paradigm, like you said, like what is next or what is the frontier? I don't think the solution is like FRP or whatever. Like I actually, as you have said to me many times, I enjoy thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from an implementation perspective, like from what code does Yehuda write every day? I think those things matter a great deal, but largely only in order to enable abstractions that are more about things that are points in time.
So what are some of those abstractions that are just on the top of your head, things that you think are important for day-to-day developers that are missing?
So I can talk about stuff that, so the reason I'm
personally... Which might be another way of asking, what are you prioritizing? Like, what do you if you could snap your fingers.
What's next? After Octane. Yeah, so I want to say that, so first of all, I think Octane, like, I don't want to rehash everything, but I think Octane ticked a lot of boxes that I would have told you a year ago or 2 years ago. One thing that I want to in general say, which is like a little more paradigm-y, but I don't really know how mathematical, how permanent it is I think Ember's original sin was push-based reactivity. And I think a lot, what Ryan Florence taught me, Pete Hunt taught me like a long time ago, is that the thing that sucks about push-based reactivity is that you guys have been talking about this, you end up spending a ton of time with thinking about the render cycle. Like you end up, when you do push-based reactivity, it's coincidental that it has to do with hooks, or that hooks has a similar mental model. But basically, like, what is an observer? Like, why does an observer need to exist? It has to exist because the data flow is like someone is telling you about it, right? So instead of saying, like, the two models are pull-based, which is like, given this input, here is the output, and push-based, which is like, whenever this input changes, please update this output. And normal programming is pull-based, right? That's like the reason that it's bad to have push-based reactivity. Normal programming is you write a function, has some inputs, produces an output. Normal programming is not whenever this input changes, do this output, produce this output.
Interesting. I like it. I'll have to, yeah, I'm going to have to chew on this, but I've never really thought about. So my initial kind of reaction is just like, well, aren't Excel spreadsheets like push-based and like?
No. So actually, I'll come back to Excel spreadsheets, but I want to say what I mean by the original sin thing. So first of all, React is pull-based normally, in the sense that a whole React, when I say normal programming is pull-based, that is almost the same thing as saying that React is pull-based reactivity. React's model is literally you run the program, right? So that unless you're doing...
you wait until you run the program to know, yeah, right.
And if you look at their docs at the philosophy, it's always telling you, try to derive your state. Right? Because the model of, here's some inputs, produce an output is like how normal programming works. So that's, when I say it's the original sin, what I mean is things like Ember data. So let's say you have an array, you have a post, an article has many comments, and you want to filter the comments by the ones that are by me, by Yehuda. The natural pull-based programming approach to that is you just like get the array, you loop over it, and you filter it, and you're done. In React, that's the natural way to write that code, because like you're writing code that looks like you're writing ERB in Rails. So like, of course, that's how you did it. And like, is it slow? Maybe, but like you didn't think about it like that. Whereas the push-based approach is like, there is this stable array, which is the comments. And how do I get the new one? Well, I have to produce a new stable array, which is the filter comments. Well, how do I do that? I honestly have no idea how to do that. So maybe Ember has an API that's like the reduced computed API or whatever that helps me do that. And the biggest thing about Glimmer 2, like the reason that Glimmer 2 really matters, is that Glimmer 2 is an implementation that eliminates the efficiency difference between those two things, right? So the original Ember said, we really need a stable array, and we need, when you filter something, we need to get a bunch of observable array events that run on the new filtered array so that we can take those things and reflect them onto the DOM. So there's this like fragile bridge between all the transformations that you have to create using very general APIs that are Ember APIs, right? Whereas in the React world and since Glimmer 2, you could just write a computer property in pre-Octane or write a getter in post-Octane or write a function in post-Octane is just like you just write the filter function. And on the front of how expensive really is it to filter an array into a new array, unless it's like 10,000 items, basically it's always fast to do that particular operation. So whether or not it's always the maximally efficient thing or not, it's usually the right thing. And it means that you could start thinking about the problem that you're trying to solve the way you write normal programming. So I think that, however, Ember Data still doesn't, in order for that to work, you have to know that, so the way post-Octane works is that if you have an array that you're deriving your filtered array from, you would, the filtered part behind the scenes knows that it's invalidated because it consumed the original array, which got behind the scenes replaced, right? But Ember Data never replaces it. So there's no actual way to know that you have to derive the update. Now there's various things that we can do to bridge the worlds, and we've done various things to do that, but they are two different worlds, right? The Ember Data approach is pushing array mutations at you. And the new Ember approach is saying, just let me know when the array changed and I'll figure it out myself. And those things, the old Ember approach is why at each exists in computer properties at all, right? And so I like not having to have at each. I like not having to have computer property dependent keys. And you simply that we really have to, Ember Data has to stop having that view of the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have a huge breaking change to change it, but it is the push and pull worlds are not the same world.
They're in conflict, and
Yes.
and resolving that conflict will be the key to unlocking the kinds of APIs that we got with Octane. And it's interesting,
That layer.
you know, all of these layers. Most of us most of us can look at an API and say, oh, I don't like that API. There's something that's off about that, or it's kind of a bummer to work with. And I just think it's interesting, you in your position, this is like the turtles all the way down. Actually what's going on here is that there's a paradigm mismatch, and it's the pull versus push.
I think it's funny. My setup to all that was I don't like paradigms, and I think it's.
But now it's demonstrating how important they are. You know.
I think it's at the implementation level. It's very important.
Yeah.
I think basically my job is to give you something that feels intuitive and compositional without having to know why.
Right. Yep.
I think React doesn't think that. React thinks you should know why. That's how it's compositional, because you know why.
That's an interesting way to frame the two positions. That's also I also want to chew on that, but I think that I might agree with that take.
So that's one. I have two things that are the next things. So that's one is we really have to finish the job. Another example of one before I go to two is query params in Ember right now are a push-based paradigm. I don't even want to explain how it works, but it fundamentally is you are mutating a query params, and it works that way. I think a good world is that query params are just a function that returns a hash of query params that uses whatever state it needs. A good way to think about it is, you want to put you have a sort by query param, you make a track property in a service, and you just use that property becomes part of your query params hash. I'm hand waving a little bit here, but I think the point is the right way to think about it is my query params are a function that gives me back all the query params. And that's the pull-based approach. The push-based approach is there's a set query param thing on the routing service or whatever. And I think in general, we need to finish the job of pull-ifying everything. Another example is title. Title is really easy because it's just a string, but in a perfect world, title is just a function. It returns a string, and the way that reflects into the title, this goes back to Ryan Florence's effects thing. There is a point at which the effect has to be derived from state, but it's thinking about everybody doing that all the time.
Right.
Is ends up being, it has all the problems that you were describing. What if things get torn down? You're relying on a very implicit thing to save things with database, whatever. Whereas saying here's a service. It has a getter on it called title. And like periodically Ember pulls it and updates the title. Like maybe there's a public API for anybody doing something. It's just not the same thing as a use effect, which is used for like really everything. Right. And part of it is like you really don't want the effect to possibly change state that's an input. That's basically the flaw, is like if you have an effect that derives from state and part of what it does is update other state, very quickly it gets out of hand. You can't really reason about whether you're doing it right or not. So you really need to treat the version of it that's like effectively an Ember observer. It's a boundary case. You need to treat that as a different thing.
Right.
That should somehow make it really hard to accidentally update state. Like it's like a function that doesn't even have access to services.
Right.
Something like that. Okay, so that's one side. It's like finishing the job of making everything pull-based. The second thing that I think is really important is roughly what I said before about React hooks being really about life cycle entanglement, which we didn't talk about Ember Concurrency a ton, but Ember Concurrency solves something like this problem for tasks. But I think tasks are not the most interesting things. I think there's a problem that hooks solve really well. I should say one thing first. Am I still here?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Modifiers. So anything in Ember templates already have lifecycle entanglement, which is why modifiers and helpers feel better. Is that like you don't really care a lot about like how many instances of a modifier or a class-based helper you get, things like that, because behind the scenes we're like dealing with the lifecycle for you. Ember Concurrency is a good example of like having that rough emotional feel, that programming model feel for tasks. But there's another case which I think is like really important and is a lot of the remaining hooks, which is you have something that is permanent. It's like attached. So use remote data is a good example of this, right? So it's the thing about a task is that a task runs like one or more times and then it's done, and then it has a callback that does something. That's a task. The kind of thing I'm talking about is it's one-to-one with your component. So it's like the remote data for all of my tweets or something like that. But inside of that thing, there's like a little state machine that is like running on its own. And PS, it has some inputs from my arguments that if the inputs change, I should like throw away the in progress little spinning state wheel and start over. I think that's like what hooks are good at. And
interesting. So that reminds me of like when we talked about, one of the arguments for use effect is that sure, it's like you have these bugs, but you have these bugs in the class component version, and this kind of forces you to deal with it. And one of those that we saw was like when you render a form and you pass a thing and you do something on did insert element, and then you forget to think about did receive address case. This kind of sounds like that. It's an API that is respecting that fact, which is that those arguments can change basically. And
I think React landed on a good set of defaults here, which is by default you have setup and maybe tear down, and by default if any of the inputs change, just throw it away and start over. But like sure, there could be an escape valve that allows you to keep the same instance for some reason if you really need it. One thing that is really good about the Ember system that React doesn't have is that auto track allows us to seal the inputs, right? So basically the way the Ember Octane system works is that any property that could change is marked as tracked, and we have this thing called auto track where we get to say, okay, starting from now until here, like observe all the gets off of track properties, which as far as anyone is concerned look like regular JavaScript gets. And then the reason that matters is that we now have a way of quickly verifying whether or not that any of the inputs changed. And so the idea is that we would be able to throw away, like if at the same time frame as we're revalidating all your templates, we would also check these things and we would say, oh, it seems like this thing went away. Like the inputs to this went away. So either tear down, restart, or run the update function, right? So, and I think like the reason I think this is very general. So first of all, it's like the mystery that I said before about why there's so many hooks is like telling you that it's very general. But the reason I think this is very general is that I think if you look at what is hard about async programming, a lot of it has to do with the fact that you have, I think Alex Machnier's post about about structural concurrency was actually pretty good on it. You have the situation where you have async function. It's just like going off into the world. It finishes at who knows what time. Like if an input into the async function changes, it's like really opaque. You have no way to do anything about that. And if the async function happens to be getting data, so I think people focus, Ember concurrency is really about tasks, like I said, but it's really common that you just have a component and the component needs to fetch some data. Like maybe it's async because it's on the server, maybe it's in IndexedDB, maybe it's in some other async, like part of some other async API, right? So like I think the general thing is like you have a thing that is logically there the whole time. It's not a task. It doesn't start and finish during the time frame of this component. It sticks around the whole time frame of the component, and it's not a piece of primitive state. It changes, but it changes.
Right, it's not like an instance of a class. It's not the same as the instance of the component. It's different.
It like changes on its own behind the scenes, and like the thing that makes it hard is and sometimes it's using inputs that could also change. Right. So when that happens, we need a general programming model way of throwing away the thing that's spinning, and start it over. And I think if you look that description, I've shown you some code, but that description is like, you can use that to model abortable fetches and things like that. Right. Because basically when you start, you remember the abort token, and then on destroy, you use it, and you have some way of like spinning up, like basically telling Ember how to spin up a new one.
Right. Right.
So I actually have one thing to say about both of these 1 and 2 together, which is I hope that async programming doesn't turn out to be so synchronous programming. When you make a database query that's synchronous is actually a pretty nice model. Actually, we talked about
user.find one in Rails.
We talked about this a little. It's not even true that synchronous programming stops the program from doing other stuff. It actually, like as discussed, most modern programming languages, including Ruby, have an ability to have as many I/O things running around in the background as they want, and then only having one CPU thing going on, right? So there's this. Basically, the synchronous model is nice. You say user.find one, and then you don't have to care about the time window in between. Right. However, it doesn't really work out for UI programming, because there's like UI programming has a million things that you can interact with, and you actually don't want it to be true that if nothing can make progress until the last thing made progress. Right. That's not good. And like if you try to model it with threads, it just ends up getting complicated, because now you have to like, oh, let me wait for these things. Like it doesn't have the nice property of like it's a sequence. Right. You start really caring a lot about not being a waterfall. So the thing that's nice about async function is that it gets you really close to it looking kind of like sequential programming, but every async function gets to decide for itself whether the async functions that it calls are sequential or not. And sure, like most people don't do it, but like once in a while you get to seams like like a route model or some piece of like what React people call like the suspense boundaries. Like once in a while you get to a point where you're like, this is the place where I don't want it to block the universe. And that in theory, async function lets you deal with, because if you write await, it's sequential. If you don't write await, now you have a promise. You can merge with promise.all, whatever. Unfortunately, that whole story doesn't tell you a lot about the lifecycle of these things. And especially if you deal with methods, but like hooks doesn't solve this problem at all. But especially if you deal with methods, you end up with these asynchronous things that aren't required to finish by the time that the closing object finished, right? So we're like really, really close from a programming model perspective to having a sequential story that's like close enough to like blocking IO. Fortunately, the fact that there's a lifecycle entanglement problem is a real issue. And actually, one last thing. The thing that's weird about both React and Ember from the perspective of normal programming is that you have a program, but then the output is like hanging out, right? And then like in some sense, the stack is like suspended forever, and you just like keep running through the suspended stack forever. And the thing I like about you have a little state machine floating around is that it tells you this is where the light bulb of use remote data helped me. It tells you that this is a noun, right? This is a list of tweets. It's not a task. It's a list of tweets. And the list of tweets might have some cycle that it goes through, but that cycle should be over by the time I go away.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's really I think getting to the point where async programming is a nouny thing. It's about the nouns and solving the problem of putting the verbs in a box, I think is a frontier that I'm excited about it.
That's interesting. So, okay, to try to recap, to kind of say that back, actually, there's some parallels with the early Ember data work and the attempts there. User.find one or .comment. User.comments. User.comments is a noun. And the fact that it fetches in the background, or the fact that you render it in a template and it makes a fetch, that was an attempt to bring something that looks
make
synchronous.
It declarative.
Yeah, exactly. Declarative and synchronous looking. And
didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, there's aspects of it that worked, and there's aspects that could be improved upon. But I think that's interesting. So, you basically your kind of working hypothesis is that synchronous looking programming is good for a lot of the reasons that we know, and but the fact is that it shouldn't be abstracted away completely, because the reality of a UI developer is that they're working on a stateful, long-lived UI that is almost multi-threaded in a certain way that you think about it, right?
It's extremely multi-threaded.
Yeah, there's things moving, and you're moving your mouse while this is saving and this is loading in over here. So it's not that you can't, the human programmer cannot be thinking about all these at the same time. So you need some way to say, in this little part of this UI where this is happening over this 10 seconds, there's some associated mini state machine with it. And
it shouldn't be written like a state machine.
It shouldn't be written like a set of steps that occur over time.
It's not Redux. It's mostly not a Redux. It's it's fine if occasionally it's a Redux, but it's mostly some track properties that changed when things happened.
And we've seen, right, and it's because we've seen what declarative rendering does for us in terms of those bugs. We go over it in that video series, and it's you don't realize how much it's actually doing for you. People who wrote Backbone apps and their own render functions do, but when you write first name in curlies and the program updates regardless of how it changes, that's huge. And yeah, that is a huge missing part in other. And
I think hooks are doing I think it's important.
That's the kernel of hooks that you like. Yes. That's the part.
That's what use remote data was about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the reason you say it's not a task is because it's not like a series of steps. It doesn't begin and then end. It's
not whether I should be clearer. It's not. It is a series of steps.
It's not a how. It's a what. It's with our load, Ryan, with our storefront load records things. It's you want to say this is the latest 10 tweets. So you're writing twitter.com and you say this is the latest 10 tweets. You want a declarative model that spans not only the template but also the data loading, so that you can just say the logic of the program, which is this is showing the latest 10 tweets, and if that changes over time, the tooling can take care of that for you. And so if it changes as a result of someone else writing a new tweet or of your client app polling the server, the ideal is to be able to just declare that logic and have the data loading story taken care of.
So I think the thing that I'm saying is the distinction between a task and one of these things is that a task has a bunch of steps, but the end of the set of steps is a callback that lets you do something else.
And you're saying you don't want that to be,
I don't mind. It's fine. It's Ember concurrency is good. It's fine if it exists. Mm-hmm. But there's if you think about getting your last 10 tweets, a task is yield
it's not right.
Some steps, and the last thing is return.
You need a higher level thing that has a notion of what happens if the thing changes. What happens if the times change? What happens if this tweet in my store is deleted from the cache? You need something.
You end up having a track property that's tweets or something.
Right.
I think you just go look at your Ember concurrency code, right? You basically end up.
We do this. We wrap our tasks in components so you can access the task, but it's through the templates. Okay, this is starting to make sense.
And I think the task itself in Ember concurrency is a nouny thing, which is really helpful. right? It's like the ongoing task is loading or whatever. And I think a perfect, the way to think about the state machine in the sky is that it might have a representation that's like it's loading. It might have a representation that it's error or whatever, but that machine in the sky is the thing that is projecting out the representation, and it's always there, right? So your component has comments. Right now there's you can have tracked comments, right? And that's getting updated by your component. And there's another thing, which is it needs a name still, but it's use comments. And you basically spin up the state machine, and it's going to start doing the steps that it needs to do, which is make the fetch or whatever. And eventually it gets to a resting state, and that comments, which are always there, are projecting out the data. And if the inputs change, right? If any of the arguments to the comments change, which is going to be ID or something, post ID, then it's going to throw out the state machine in the sky, and it's going to create a new one, and the new one is going to start projecting the data, right? So and I think I just said a thing that made it sound like it's going to be very complicated. The actual code is going to be a method called start or something like that, which does the fetch in it, and that thing has a bunch of .bends which are setting track properties, and then there's some way of saying what is the projection,
and that's going to be a stable thing. It's a stable thing, because that's how we're thinking.
The projection, it looks stable.
Yeah.
Basically, I think this is a key thing that is related to my original sin point earlier. It's very important that you be allowed to have something that feels like it's there, even though the representation might be changing a lot.
There's element modifiers, right? Something like that.
It's like element modifiers, and it's also what hooks are. Right? Basically you can't see the container that a React hook is coming from. Now, I think it's my design for this particular thing lets you see it, but you're not you don't care about the identity. You care about the projection.
Right.
And I think the whole big picture here is to try to make everything, feel synchronous and feel nouny. And this is an area where the lack of synchronousness is leaking. And if you look at the code that's surrounding it to deal with it, now there's all these state machine-y aspects in your component, when really what you want to say is there's a thing. It's the comments.
Yep. I follow. That's interesting. And I definitely follow. Cool.
I answered your question.
I think so. Yeah. Are you feel good about UI development in 2019 right now? When you look at Angular and Ember and React and Vue and Svelte, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, so I think now I need to be very.
Maybe let's end on a positive note. What?
No, I do. I feel good. I feel good. I'm just trying to figure out how to make it sound as maximally positive as possible. So, I think people have a tendency to think about programming as having a lot more iterations than you think. So programming is in some sense, people did the first GUI programming in the 70s. That seems like a long time ago. There's a lot of sense of well, we already what really is new here? We already did MVC in the 80s. What's new? And I think people really underappreciate how much of programming is so defined by the context. So sure, there was a Smalltalk image, which is what people developed until the late 90s. That doesn't look a lot like our system. I don't even like it that much. And then we had the web. Then we had many years of IE6 being the only web browser. Then we had a bunch of years of Chrome catching up to something. And now we have a few years of somewhat healthy, somewhat not always perfectly healthy environment, really 5 years worth of it, of web browsers that are good enough to build UI frameworks inside of. And we've spent the last 5 years with people telling us that we should not try to do that the correct solution is to use the platform. So I just don't think there's that much time, there's not as much time as people think. People think oh, what really could be left?
Yeah.
And in some sense, the answer is we didn't, we're really only getting. If you would have tried to build a React model in the 80s or 90s, it would have been too slow.
Sure. You can't even have scroll bars, without highlighting, outlining them or whatever.
And I think people also really underestimate how much the web is multi-platform rendering system. Like people always forget, like the select box is not one thing. A select box it's like a bunch of things. And even if you look at, iOS 11, iOS 12, every new one has a different version. Imagine if that's what Flex had to do. Imagine if you as a developer had to either make a totally new select box or track every single iteration of every single operating system.
That's a very good point that I do not really think about regularly, but that's a really good point.
And like, imagine if you had to care about the accessibility of that.
Right.
Right. Like there's just, I think people really underappreciate how much the web platform is a bunch of people taking on the responsibility of building a cross-platform UI toolkit. And people always say, oh, well, we already solved that with WX widgets or whatever. This is like the problem of having an input type equals text, range, calendar, select box that works correctly in all platforms, that has accessibility, that supports pasting and auto-completing and works on mobile. Like this is already like someone's life's work.
Right.
So
I
think
it doesn't have to be updated. Right.
And exactly. And it's new. So I think basically I find it unsurprising in some sense that there's a lot to do. And I think there is a lot to do. I think React did a good job in 2015 of like jerking us out of cargo culting the last 20 years before that, which is great. I think that was for the best. And I think now that we got out of that, we're actually in new territory. And I think figuring out how to build, like, what is the declarative answer to asynchronous programming? Like, maybe Smalltalk would have just used synchronous IO. But like, no, we don't want to do that. We actually want scrolling to work correctly. What is the solution? How does it work on very slow devices, right? These are all real problems. And it's fun. It's not rehashing old stuff.
I love that. I love that because I personally, I'm totally on board with all that. And when people say, I don't have as much experience as you or other people working at that level, but when people say, oh man, another year, another JavaScript framework has discovered something in the 70s, and I'm just like, there's something in me that knows that's wrong, even if I can't maybe articulate it the way you did. But it's really interesting. The web is very unique, and I think a lot of us are excited about it. And
yep, it's good.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much for all your time and all your work on Ember. And again, I know that sometimes we can come to the podcast with our frustrations and can spark some conversation between us. But I will say that I've had a wonderful 4 or 5 years writing Ember. I still write Ember every day and love it. And the fact that it gave me an opportunity to meet you and for us to become friends, like I said at the beginning of the episode, you're definitely without a doubt the biggest influence in my programming life. So I really appreciate all of that and all the work you do.
I also just want to say that yes, you can, everybody has criticisms of everything. That's fine. I think the reason I like listening to the podcast is that I think you do a good job of really digging into why you feel the way you feel. And there's so much of, if you listen to podcasts in general, there's so much of people just regurgitating what they're supposed to believe. And I think that doesn't help me a lot. Whereas you doing, I joked about this in the beginning, but you doing a lot of user studies that I don't personally have the fortitude to do, like actually teaches me a lot about how people are experiencing.
Cool. Awesome. Well, we can't wait to see you next time. You're in New York. We're in Portland, EmberConf, but we appreciate you, Yehuda. Thanks a lot for being on the show. And we'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. See ya. Bye.